D is for Dungeon is an old-school dungeon crawler that was entered in the 2014 Indie Game Maker contest, and tries to sell itself by putting the crawl into Dungeon Crawler, by starring an infantile hero. Of course, the real question is, will this game put a crinkle in your thoughts about indie games, or will it put a smile on your face? Plot-wise, D is for Dungeon is extremely minimalistic, only offering a brief backstory explaining how every 500 years, that demons escape from the underworld and that every time this happens, a hero marked with the symbol of light will appear to stop them. This cycle has repeated itself many times throughout the ages, but for some reason the demons have emerged 20 years early this time. The king, in a desperate bid to save his people, has scattered his forces throughout his lands, in a desperate search to find this hero in order to turn back the demon menace. But his knights only find brazen liars who are either cowardly or useless in this conflict. In desperation, the king takes a walk around his castle, and manages to stumble across the chosen hero of light. Albeit this hero is still a toddler, but the king decides to send him into the underworld in order to stop the approaching darkness. And that is basically the entire plot of the game, with the only other dialogue outside of the intro coming from the final boss. The main hero is entirely silent outside of the crinkle of his diapers, and his summoned companions appear to be empty vessels that can fight rather than actual characters. In fact, there is almost as much text in the ending credits as there are in the intro and the game itself, which is sort of disappointing for me in some respects, since I tend to prefer games with more developed plot, even if those developments hit on all the usual cliches. But my own feelings aside, this game does do a decent job explaining the world of D is for Dungeon, and at least gives the player a clear objective. Warning: this section may be a little out of date, since I played the version of the game that was submitted to the Indie Game Maker contest, but the game has since been updated in an attempt to deal with some of the problems that I'll discuss here, so the problems that I bring up may not be as big of an issue or an issue at all in the most recent update. So if you want to experience the game as I did, I'd suggest downloading the game from the 2014 Indie Game Maker contest submission page. If you wish to experience the updated game which may have solved these problems, then I recommend you downloading the game from the rpgmaker.net link I'll provide in my description. D is for Dungeon features an active time battle system with non-random encounters. Many of the enemies in the game will chase after you if they spot you, and will almost always catch you since many of them are significantly faster than you are. On the downside, the game's biggest flaw resides in the combat itself. The game suffers from rather obvious balance issues, so much so that the player is far better off creating glass cannons that favor melee attacks rather than balanced characters or magicians. The sheer advantage a character that specializes in bustle and brawn is rather staggering, and can easily be observed throughout my let's play of the game on the casual setting. But this strategy even works on the hardcore setting with little if any drawbacks when it comes to engaging your opponents. It's as if the game maker assumed that players would focus on brawn or some other stat before improving the rate at which they can attack, which was a mistake in my opinion. Outside of the combat aspects of the game, it also features many puzzles which range from easy to slightly frustrating. Although if you approach them with a calm and focused mind, they can usually be overcome in a matter of minutes. And if puzzles aren't your thing, you can buy an item at the store for 500 gold pieces to solve the puzzles for you. Though why you would waste money on this item is beyond me, since the puzzles aren't overly hard brain crushers that will take hours to solve on your own. Visually speaking, the game makes solid use of its tile sets, and does offer a wider range of variety than you might expect, with each section of the dungeon being given a unique look. I know on my first playthrough I wasn't expecting to stumble into a forest on floor 7. The only real complaint I have with the game in terms of its graphics is that some of the enemies in the final floors can hinder you from seeing the attack gauge of your enemies. In terms of background music, the game never really stood out to me, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, I tend to forget about most soundtracks as soon as they stop, unless a background song catches my attention like My Glasses Are Addicted from Monokama, which I'll then listen to for hours on end. D is for Dungeon is an old-school dungeon crawler that suffers from balance issues, but the puzzles are more than enough to keep me entertained even if the combat is a bit lacking, even on the hardcore level. And while I'd personally consider this game more of a time killer because of its lack of plot and character development, it isn't a bad way to kill time for me, and should appeal more to actual fans of old-school dungeon crawlers. Despite my love for RPGs, I can't say that I care too much for games like this, but my personal taste isn't the end-all be-all for gaming either.